So, welcome everyone. I'm sorry that I'm getting these out Thursday evening. For some reason, me and PowerPoint started beefing. I don't know what happened. Maybe I heard about my relationship with Canva and Prezi. I don't know. But anyway, we're on Zoom now and things seem to be working. So, we're going to go ahead and get started, and we're doing chapters 5 and chapter 6. And this will be chapter 5, the history of the counseling profession. And this chapter is important because it helps us to understand where our profession came from and how it's developed over time and where we might be headed in the future. So we'll go ahead and dive in. And so, the counseling profession, history and trends. As you read in the book, in the 1800s, we had several key movements to happen to lay the foundation for what would later become counseling. This was a period marked by some major social reforms. Reformers were pushing for a more humane treatment of people with mental illness, and social workers were stepping in at that time to help the poor, and those who were struggling the most in society. And another important influence is John Dewey, who you also read about. He was an educational reformer, and his humanistic writings emphasized the role of education in helping people reach their potential. So he believed that education wasn't just about, memorizing facts or just learning some material. He felt that it was about preparing individuals to live meaningful lives and become people who can contribute to society positively rather to society. And so even before counseling had a name, these seeds are being planted through things like social reform, through advocacy for humane treatment, and through people like John Dewey, who had this educational philosophy that valued the whole person. And so the combination of all of those set the stage for what we now know as counseling. And so the counseling profession, by the 1800s, we had a more formal movement toward counseling that began to take shape. And this was largely because of the growing need for vocational guidance. And so if you remember from like the U.S. history class, this was the time period of the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, and waves of immigration to major U.S. cities. So people needed help once they got there, figuring out what kind of jobs they could do, how to succeed, and how to adapt to this, this new age, this rapidly changing world. And so, at the same time, new tools were emerging. We had some testing come about. The Binet intelligence test and other group tests were introduced, new ways to measure ability, and psychology was developing fields like psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And these approaches began to influence what would become counseling. So altogether, you had industrialization, immigration, education reform, and these new scientific approaches like psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. These approaches to human behavior, they created the perfect environment for counseling movement to begin. So we'll zoom into vocational guidance. Um, this was in the early 1900s. And this is really when counseling starts to take like a recognizable shape. And so we'll begin with a few pioneers that worked in schools. And so first we had Jesse B. Davis. And in 1907, the book talks about how in Grand Rapids he designed one of the first guidance curricula where he embedded this moral and vocational guidance program into English composition classes. So the students were writing about choices and values and work. And around that same time in New York City, Eli Weaver, who had written Choosing Their Career, he also organized vocational guidance efforts across schools. And out on the West Coast, Anna Reed established guidance services in the Seattle schools. And so by 1910, plans for vocational guidance existed in 35 cities across the U.S. And so it was spreading pretty quickly. And, and so the single person who most um, crystallized this movement was Frank Parsons. and he was often called the founder of vocational guidance in the U.S. And he was influenced by social reform spirit leaders like Jane Addams at Hull House. And I remember somebody writing about that in one of the reflection papers. So I know you all may be familiar with that. But he argued that guidance should be systematic and individualized and humane. And his thought process or his vision was that guidance should be embedded in schools, then to be scaled nationally and delivered through individual counseling with cooperation valued over this kind of aggressive, cutthroat competition that was going on before. And so he had added a little bit of a change to it and added the individual counseling with the cooperation aspect. And his hometown of Boston actually hosted the first vocational guidance conference in 1913. And that ended up being formalized into the National Vocational Guidance Association. He insisted that even an expert could not make the decision for the client. Only the person can choose. And so he thought the counselor should be frank, genuine, but honest and kind, and help clients to develop analytical skills so that they can decide what they want to do outside of the counseling room, not just in the counseling room. And so that approach, the collaborative, respectful, giving the power to the client, that stance and that approach echoes what we have today for modern counseling. And finally, as the movement matured, we had people like John Brewer, who pushed guidance to expand beyond jobs into the total educational context. And so he wanted counselors to support student adjustment, be involved in curriculum planning, classroom management, and to use testing. And so this set the stage for counseling to grow from a narrow vocational focus into more of a comprehensive developmental service for students. So with the expansion of the testing movement, as we move into the early 1900s, that was one of the biggest developments, expansion of testing. And so they had these tests like Army Alpha and Army Beta, and they were used during World War One to place soldiers. And the Army Alpha test was for literate recruits, and the Army Beta test was for those who couldn't read. Now, these were good in the fact that they represented some of the first large scale attempts for us to measure ability in a systematic way. So, it's the first time that psychologists were able to, or they were trying to assess people's strengths and weaknesses quickly on a massive scale and use those results to make decisions. So it was a huge step forward in terms of creating tools to help people with vocational guidance and placement. But again, we have another double-edged sword. On one edge, the test could be incredibly helpful because they allow the counselors and educators to identify students' aptitudes and interests. And they also, gave us a structured way to guide people towards careers in which they might succeed. But on the other edge, these tests were often deeply flawed and biased, research has shown. For example, the Army Alpha and Beta were written with content that reflected mainstream urban American culture and English language skills. So that meant that immigrants or people from rural areas like I'm from a very small town in Yazoo County, or people with, different cultural backgrounds, they often scored poorly. And it wasn't because they lacked intelligence, but it was because the tests weren't designed with them in mind. You can't give a fish a test to climb a tree because that's all outside of its element. So the tests weren't designed with everyone in mind. And so oftentimes people who were not mainstream urban American did poorly on the test, and they got placed in areas where they should have been placed because of the results. So the spread of psychotherapy, um, alongside the testing movement, we had this spread of psychotherapy. And an important figure here is Clifford Beers, who's in this picture. He was a Yale graduate who struggled with schizophrenia, and he spent years in psychiatric hospitals. And after his release, he wrote a groundbreaking book called A Mind That Found Itself. And he talked about this, like the treatment that he experienced inside of the mental hospital, which he described as brutal and inhumane. And so his story, as people read it, it sparked public outrage, and it led to the founding of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene in 1909. And so this organization lobbied Congress to pass laws improving the conditions in mental institutions. And it also established some of the first child guidance clinics. And these clinics were staffed by social workers, psychologists, and psychiatrists, and they provided community-based care, which was really revolutionary for the time. Also, World War One played a major role in the spread of psychotherapy. Soldiers returning from combat often struggle with what we now recognize as PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, it was called shell shock, but we now call it PTSD. And so psychoanalysts and psychologists found that the traditional long-term methods of psychoanalysis weren't effective for these veterans. They needed something that was shorter term and had more practical approaches. And so that also helped set the stage for these modern counseling techniques. We also see the emergence of E.G. Williamson's Minnesota point of view, that was also known as the trait and factor theory, which we saw on page 71 of the book. This was one of the first comprehensive counseling theories, and Williamson borrowed from Frank Parsons' vocational guidance model, but expanded it into a broader framework that included 5 steps: analysis, synthesis, diagnosis, counseling, and follow-up. And so he was trying to do an early attempt to create like a structured, replicable process for helping clients. And then we moved to Carl Rogers, who is a big deal in counseling. He was influenced by the wave of European humanists who fled to the U.S. during World War II and brought their humanistic practices with them. And so he developed his groundbreaking client-centered therapy. And I know you all are taking theories right now, and so I don't know if you've gotten to like person-centered therapy just yet, but Carl Rogers, he brought client-centered therapy to the forefront in the U.S. And at first, he worked from a psychodynamic approach at the Rochester Guidance Center, but eventually it shifted to a non-directive model that emphasized empathy, genuineness, and unconditional positive regard. Because Rogers believed that the counselor's role wasn't to dictate solutions, but to create a supportive environment where clients could find their own path. And so we're going to move into the 1950s. By the 1950s, counseling was truly emerging and beginning to take shape or find its identity as its own profession. And so we had Carl Rogers, like I said, with client-centered therapy. He continued to work to transform the field, and counselors began to see themselves less as experts and more as facilitators of growth. And so this was a huge philosophical shift that still defines much of what we do as counseling today. We also saw the rise of developmental theories. So instead of only focusing on problems, these theories emphasize predictable stages of development across the lifespan. So like in career, in childhood, with like PHAs, stages of development and personal growth. And you'll get to these stages. I don't know if you all have taken lifespan yet. You may have taken it this summer. But the idea was that if counselors understood the tasks and challenges that people face at each stage of life, then they could better provide, support, more proactive support, because they know that from this age group typically experiences these challenges. And so they could be proactive in their treatment and their support. And so one of the most surprising events, I think, and also the book talks about, notes as one of the most surprising events, was Sputnik. So the first Russian satellite that launched in 1957. And so the event shocked the U.S. and it spurred Congress to pass the National Defense Education Act in 1958. And so with that came a huge demand for school counselors who could identify and support students with special talent in math and science. And the goal was to ensure that America could compete scientifically and technology with other countries like Russia. And this act funded the rapid training of school counselors, and later in 1964, it wasn't just for high school counselors, but in 1964, it was expanded to include elementary school counselors as well. And in the 1950s, we also saw a growth in college counseling centers with the GI Bill, bringing thousands of World War II veterans into higher education. So there was a need for counselors to support not just academics, but also the mental health of each student. And so that's when you saw the rise of college counseling centers, and they adopted the humanistic and developmental approaches of the time, reflecting the changing nature of higher education. So finally, the last thing I mentioned on this slide is that the profession itself became more organized. And so you see these different acronyms there. Those are counseling related associations that merged to form the American Personnel and Guidance Association. That's APGA, which we now know as ACA, but at the time it was APGA. And over time, this group expanded to include specialized divisions like the American School Counselor Association, the Association for Counselor Education and Supervision, and others, reflected the increasing diversity of roles within counseling. So the 1950s were a big turning point for counseling because it grew beyond the roots in just vocational guidance and became a profession with a broad base. So we were now in schools, in colleges, in communities, and also within professional organizations. So moving into the 1960s, we had even more diversification. And so the 1960s was a decade of new ideas, social change, and professional growth. And so in terms of theory, we saw the rise of approaches that are still influential today. So we have Albert Ellis and REBT, which is rational emotive therapy, which later became a cornerstone of the cognitive behavioral approaches. Albert Bandura, Joseph Wolfe, and John Krumholtz, I think I'm saying his name correctly, they advanced behavioral approaches focusing on how learning and conditioning could shape behavior and be applied in counseling. Then we have William Glasser, who introduced reality therapy, Fritz Perls, who pioneered Gestalt therapy, and Viktor Frankl, who Dr. Hodges mentioned, I believe in the last chapter's lecture when she mentioned the book Man's Search for Meaning. That's Viktor Frankl. He and Rollo May, they brought existential approaches to the forefront. And then we have transactional analysis that also emerged, focusing on communication patterns. And at the same time, there was a legislative push for mental health services under President Johnson's Great Society Initiative. And so that's when the Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963 funded centers that provided a wide range of services from inpatient and outpatient care to emergency services and consultation. And these centers made counseling more accessible to everyday people and not just those who could afford to go to the office and see, a psychoanalyst, a private psychoanalyst. Legislation also expanded the training and employment of counselors. So amendments to the NDEA extended funding to train counselors from elementary school through junior college. And then by 1967, nearly 20,000 school counselors had been trained as a result of that amendment. And other programs like Head Start, Job Corps, which is no more, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act also created opportunities for counselors to play new roles. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Economic Opportunity Act all contributed to reshaping social attitudes and highlighted the importance of addressing systemic barriers, something that counseling began to take into account. And lastly, I will say that the professionalization of counseling also happened in the 1960s. The American Personal and Guidance Association adopted its first ethical code in 1961, and the field began to take accreditation standards more seriously. And so membership grew in APGA, new divisions were formed, and state branches were also recommended at that time. So the 1960s, again, new theories, new laws, new levels of professionalism, and new divisions in state branches. So now going to the 1970s, if the 60s were about diversification, then the 70s were about proliferation. So counseling began to continue to expand across settings, theories, and professional structures. And one of the biggest shifts came from the 1975 Supreme Court decision in O'Connor versus Donaldson. And this ruling essentially said that people could not be kept in a state mental hospital against their will if they weren't a danger to themselves or others. So it wasn't until 1975 that somebody said, you know what, we cannot lock people up against their will if they're not a danger to themselves or others. We can't just lock them up because somebody says they need to be in a mental hospital. And so as a result, tens of thousands of individuals across the U.S. were deinstitutionalized, meaning they were released from hospitals, and that created a massive need for community mental health counselors. And so Congress responded by expanding the original Community Mental Health Centers Act and increased the required services from 5 categories to 12. And the book, lists all 12 of those categories. And the services included, now they included things like outpatient care, emergency services, alcohol and drug abuse treatment, and services for children and the elderly, and also transitional care. So the 1970s brought that, and it also brought new legislation for individuals with disabilities. And so in 1973, we had the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it guaranteed vocational rehabilitation, or what you'll hear us call sometimes voc rehab services for adults with severe disabilities. And in 1975, we also had the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which we now know as IDEA. For those who work in education, probably have heard about that. And that guaranteed the right to an education in the least restrictive environment. And so school counselors became an integral part of school admin team deciding on how to support students with disabilities, which expanded their role significantly. Another innovation that came was the micro counseling skills training. And so instead of just focusing on theories, the counselor training programs began emphasizing specific skills such as active listening, reflection, and empathy. Many of these that were drawn from Carl Rogers' client-centered approach. Just why I mean he was really a big deal for counseling in the humanistic side of it. And so these micro counseling skills training help to standardize what counselors in training actually practice, in session. And so again, we see ACEs. We see more professionalization for the counseling field. The American the Association for Counseling Education and Supervision, ACES, began drafting standards for master's level counseling programs, and also certification became a reality. So the Council on Rehabilitation Education began certifying counselors in 1973. That's CORE, um, which CORE is not a thing anymore. Now KCREP does that, but we'll talk about that later. And the National Academy for Certified Mental Health Counselors also began credentialing and certifying people in 1979. More divisions came. We saw the um, Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development, which is AMCD, in 1972, and the Association for Specialists in Group Work, ASGW, that was in 1973, and the American Mental Health Counseling Association in 1978. So counseling, was broadening to meet the needs of diverse clients and communities. Also a service that's for spirituality and counseling. And the IAAOC deals with alcohol and drugs and substance abuse. And so you can see that it was beginning to really meet the needs of people, of the community. So moving along to the 1980s and the 1990s, I'm a 1990s baby. We'll see here that counseling entered like this, what I call like a settling in phase. And I think the book says something similar, like a settling in phase in the 80s and 90s. And so the profession had grown rapidly, and it was now time to get a little bit more professional and begin to standardize more. And one major development of that was CACREP, which is the Council for Accreditation of Counseling and Related Educational Programs. So CACREP established formal standards for counselor education, and this ensures that master's and doctoral programs across the country had a common foundation. And so when you apply to programs, you look online, if a school is CACREP accredited, they're usually going to have that somewhere in bold, because every school is not. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have a good program. It just means that they're not CACREP accredited. And a lot of times when you apply for doc programs or you apply for licensure, they're going to require a CACREP program because they know that at some point across 8 years, you have been evaluated to see if your training is meeting the standards set forth by the profession. And so that's why it's always recommended to attend a CACREP program, CACREP accredited program. So in 1982, NBCC, which is the National Board of Certified Counselors, that was established in 1982, and it offered the first national certification exam. And this gave counselors a way to demonstrate their competence and help unify the profession around a shared credential. Around the same time, more states began offering licensure for counselors, further solidifying counseling as a distinct, recognized field, like psychologists who had testing and certifications already. So now we were getting into that, and we were offering licensure, and we had the credentialing and certification. And so another major shift in the 90s was multicultural counseling. And CACREP, this is partly because of CACREP, because CACREP required multicultural content in all accredited programs, and they wanted it to be embedded throughout each class. And so not just in multicultural class, but you should be discussing multicultural competence in any class that you're taking in the counseling curriculum. In 1991, the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development formally adopted multicultural counseling competencies. And this was huge because it pushed programs to really prepare counselors to work effectively across, diverse cultures, identities, and communities. And you can Google those. They're online, pull them down. I'm pretty sure if you're taking multicultural counseling now that y'all have looked at them. And so, in addition to multicultural competence, the 80s and 90s also brought a sharper focus on ethics. And so before the 80s, counseling texts barely touched on ethical issues, but by the 1990s, there was an explosion of research and writing on ethical decision making, supervision of ethics, teaching ethics, and even the ethics of online counseling. Even though it wasn't super big then, technology was beginning to emerge, and so there was even writing about ethics of online counseling. The ACA Code of Ethics was revised in the 1990s, and NBCC also created ethical guidelines for online practice, um, which shows like the field was seeing the change and they were responding and adapting and creating ethical guidelines to ensure counselors were, providing the best support they could to clients in an ethical way. During the 80s and 90s, there were also some turbulence in professional organizations. APGA changed its name twice. First, it was the American Association for Counseling and Development, so AACD in 1983. And then it became the American Counseling Association, so ACA, in 1992. And at the same time, some divisions like the American Mental Health Counselors Association and the American School Counselor Association, ASCA, threatened to leave ACA. And so that was the 80s and the 90s. We had identity. People wanted to form their identities. We had credibility through K-Prep, and standards. We also had the focus on ethics. And so a lot happened in the 80s and 90s. So moving on to the evolution of Professional Counseling Association, we'll kind of zoom in here on how the association evolved over time. And we'll start with in 1952. Like I said earlier, we had the AGPA, brought together school counselors, counselor educators, career specialists, and rehab counselors all under one umbrella. And so they also began to add, all the specialized divisions like ASCA, ACES, ARCA, to reflect the, growing diversity and the needs. And so then we fast forward to the 80s and you'll see two major name changes. So we're no longer AGPA, but we're AACD. And then in 92, like I said, we became ACA, which is what we're known today. And so each change just wasn't like, a cosmetic name change because it sounded better or anything like that. But it really signaled a stronger, clearer professional identity from personnel and guidance, vocational guidance and this moralistic aspect of it toward a more unified identity around counseling. And at the same time, divisions kept expanding, which was both a strength and a challenge. So big takeaways here from this evolution are, the association's name changes, kind of track the fields, move from guidance to a more confident professional identity in counseling. And secondly, like the proliferation of the divisions shows how we were adjusting to meet the needs and the richness of our different practice areas. And thirdly, the moments of organizational friction. So that's like the disaffiliation of the different divisions and autonomy debates. And so that is it for chapter 5, and I'm going to record chapter 6. I hope that you all are able to follow along with me and understand this. This is like my third or fourth time trying to record it because, again, I said me and PowerPoint were beefing, and I had to come over to Zoom. And so I've done this 3 or 4 times, and my words started to trip up on me. You would think I would have gotten better. Now it's like time 3, but it looks like I've gotten kind of tired of because I've said it so much. But I hope this was understandable, and we will talk a little bit about it in class too. We won't go through this whole presentation, but I will hit some high points. And so stay tuned for chapter 6.